Picture this. It's 11:30 on a Saturday night in sunny Spain. Soccer fans are leaving a popular bar after watching the Champions League final. The atmosphere should be celebratory. But in the shadows, a black-clad figure emerges from a waiting car. 2 shots ring out. 2 men fall dead on the pavement. The gunman vanishes into the night, leaving behind a trail of blood that stretches not just across southern Spain, but all the way back to the grimy streets of Glasgow, Scotland. What you're about to discover is how a 25-year-old feud between 2 Scottish crime families has transformed from local turf wars into an international nightmare. A story of stolen drugs, acid attacks, machete violence, and murders that span continents. This is the story of Scotland's most dangerous gang war, and how it went global. Our story begins not in the sun-soaked streets of Spain's Costa del Crime, but in the concrete jungle of Glasgow, Scotland, a city that spent decades trying to shed its violent reputation, transforming itself into a celebrated city of culture. But beneath this carefully crafted image, something sinister was brewing. For over 2 decades, 2 families have been locked in a blood feud that would make the Montagues and Capulets look like a neighborhood disagreement. On one side, the Lyons clan. On the other, the Daniel family. Between them lies a trail of bodies, burned buildings, and broken lives that stretches back to the year 2001. But what could possibly spark a war that would rage for a quarter of a century? The answer lies in £20,000 worth of white powder and a robbery that would unleash hell. The year was 2001. Cocaine was still relatively new to Scotland's criminal underworld. While heroin had long been the drug of choice in Glasgow's impoverished housing estates, this new substance promised far greater profits. The dealers had even given it a nickname, Morningside Speed, named after Edinburgh's most affluent suburb. In a Daniel gang safe house, £20,000 worth of this precious commodity sat waiting. It should have been secure. It should have been untouchable. It wasn't. Someone from the Lyons gang had been watching, waiting, planning, and when the moment was right, they struck, making off with the entire stash. Now, £20,000 might not sound like much in today's drug trade, but in 2001, it was enough to start a war. A war that would consume 2 families, terrorize entire communities, and ultimately spread its tentacles across Europe. The Daniels wanted their drugs back. More importantly, they wanted blood. And blood is exactly what they would get. To understand this war, you need to understand the soldiers who would fight it. Eddie Lyons Sr. wasn't your typical community leader. By day, he ran what appeared to be legitimate community projects in Glasgow's Milton housing estate. He even convinced local councillors to let him use a former school building for his community work. What those naive politicians didn't realize was that they had just handed over a building to one of Glasgow's most dangerous crime bosses. The community center would later be shut down after complaints that it had become a gang headquarters. But if Eddie Lyons Sr. was the politician of the family, his son Eddie Jr. would become its enforcer. And on the other side of this bloody equation stood a man whose very name struck fear into Glasgow's underworld. Kevin "Gerbil" Carroll. Carroll wasn't just a criminal. He was an artist of violence. His signature move became known throughout Glasgow as alien abductions. Rivals would simply disappear. Days later, they'd be found dumped on street corners, semi-naked, traumatized beyond repair, and claiming they couldn't remember what had happened to them. But Carroll's victims knew. They just weren't talking. Carroll had another motivation for his war against the Lyons family. According to sources close to the investigation, he claimed to have been bullied by members of the Lyons clan during his school days. Now, with the power of the Daniel gang behind him, it was time for payback. But Carroll would take this personal vendetta to a level that shocked even Glasgow's hardened criminal underworld. What he did next crossed a line that even gangsters considered sacred. In 1991, 8-year-old Gary Lyons died of leukemia. For his family, including his older brother Eddie Jr., it was an unimaginable tragedy, the kind of loss that transcends the brutal world of gang warfare. Gary's gravestone stood in a Glasgow cemetery as a memorial to an innocent child taken far too soon. A place where family members could come to mourn, to remember, to find some small measure of peace. Kevin Gerbil Carroll decided to destroy that peace. In an act that stunned even his fellow criminals, Carroll vandalized the child's gravestone. He desecrated the memory of an 8-year-old boy who had never hurt anyone, who had died of a disease he couldn't control, whose only crime was being born a Lyons. In the underworld, there are rules, unwritten codes that even the most hardened criminals respect. Family members who aren't in the life are off limits. Children are sacred. The dead should rest in peace. Carroll had broken every one of these rules. The response was swift and merciless. On February 11th, 2010, Kevin Gerbil Carroll walked into an Asda supermarket car park in Glasgow, probably thinking about nothing more than his weekly shopping. He would never walk out. As horrified shoppers watched, gunmen opened fire in broad daylight. Carroll fell to the pavement, his reign of terror finally over. The man who had terrorized Glasgow for years was dead, executed in full view of families doing their Saturday shopping. Carroll was so hated that police had nearly 100 potential suspects for his murder. In most cases, narrowing down that list would be the detective's primary challenge. In this case, the challenge was different. Which of Carroll's many enemies had finally gotten to him first? But rather than ending the feud, Carroll's death was about to make it infinitely worse. You might think that Carroll's death would have satisfied the Lyons family's thirst for vengeance. You might think that both sides would step back from the brink, that cooler heads would prevail. You would be wrong. For 6 years after Carroll's murder, an uneasy peace held. Both gangs continued their criminal enterprises, but the open warfare seemed to have ended. Glasgow's police allowed themselves to hope that maybe, just maybe, the city's most dangerous feud was finally over. Then, in 2016, everything changed. Jamie Daniel, the founding father of the Daniel Gang, died of cancer. Unlike most of his criminal contemporaries, Daniel had managed something remarkable. He died peacefully, in his bed, surrounded by family. But his peaceful death was about to unleash the most violent chapter in this saga yet. With Jamie Daniel gone, there was suddenly a power vacuum at the heart of one of Scotland's most dangerous criminal organizations. Territory was up for grabs. Drug routes needed new management. Most importantly, someone needed to decide who would lead the Daniel Gang into its next chapter. The Lyons family saw their opportunity. In just 5 months, they launched 5 separate murder attempts against Daniel Gang members. 5 calculated strikes designed to decapitate their enemies once and for all. But what happened to Stephen Bonzo Daniel would shock even Scotland's violence-hardened police force. It was a scene from a Hollywood action movie. Except the blood was real and the screams were genuine. Stephen Daniel's car roared through the streets of North Glasgow at over 100 miles per hour, with his would-be assassins in hot pursuit. The chase ended when Daniel's car finally crashed. But his ordeal was just beginning. The Lyons gang members dragged him from the wreckage and produced machetes. What they did next was so savage that when paramedics arrived, they initially thought Daniel had been shot. His face was slashed so badly that his nose was hanging by threads of skin near his ear. Blood pooled on the pavement as Daniel lay semi-conscious, his features almost unrecognizable. This wasn't just attempted murder. This was a message, a brutal demonstration of what happened to anyone who opposed the Lyons family. But the Daniels were far from finished. While Glasgow's gangs were macheteing each other in car parks and housing estates, something far more dangerous was happening behind the scenes. These weren't just local thugs fighting over street corners anymore. The Lyons family had formed an alliance that would transform them from Scottish criminals into international players. Their new partners were Ireland's notorious Kinahan Cartel, an organization so dangerous that its leadership had fled to Dubai to escape Dublin's law enforcement. Suddenly, the stakes were much higher than £20,000 worth of stolen cocaine. The Kinahan Cartel controlled supply routes that stretched from South America through Europe. Their product was measured not in thousands, but in millions. And now, they had chosen the Lyons family as their Scottish distributors. One Lyons family member had already relocated to Dubai after an attempt on his life in Glasgow back in 2006. From his Middle Eastern base, he was reportedly building what insiders called a Celtic cartel, a partnership between Scottish and Irish criminals that could flood the UK with South American cocaine. This wasn't just about Glasgow anymore. This was about international drug trafficking on a scale that Scottish law enforcement had never seen before. But with greater profits came greater risks. And when you're swimming with international sharks, sometimes the biggest danger doesn't come from your oldest enemies. Sometimes it comes from your newest friends. By 2023, the war had evolved beyond recognition. This wasn't the same feud that had started over £20,000 of stolen drugs. The players were the same, but the game had changed completely. Homes were firebombed across central Scotland. Businesses, garages, taxi companies, beauty salons went up in flames. Suspected associates were attacked with machetes in broad daylight. Even well-heeled districts of Edinburgh weren't safe anymore. But perhaps most chilling of all, the gangsters started posting videos of their handiwork online. Masked thugs filmed themselves as they destroyed property, as they terrorized communities, as they turned Glasgow's carefully cultivated image as a city of culture into a global embarrassment. The violence was reaching far beyond the gangs themselves. Russell Findlay, now leader of the Scottish Conservatives, but formerly an investigative journalist, had written a book about the Daniel Lyons feud called Caught in the Crossfire. The title proved prophetic. In 2015, 3 years after his book's publication, Findlay answered his front door to find a man waiting for him. Before he could react, acid was thrown in his face, leaving him permanently scarred. I remember thinking at the time, Findlay would later say, "Why is nobody else saying enough is enough?" This is what happens when organized crime becomes too powerful. They try to take on mainstream society. The attack on Findlay wasn't an isolated incident. Across Scotland, the tentacles of gang violence were reaching into legitimate society. Councillors were being intimidated. Prison officers' cars were being firebombed. The gangs weren't content to fight each other anymore. They were taking on the state itself. Which brings us back to that Saturday night in Fuengirola, Spain. Back to Monahan's bar, with its happy hour specials and big screen TVs. Back to Ross Monahan and Eddie Lyons Jr., watching football and probably feeling safer than they had in years. They were wrong. Spain's Costa del Sol has long been known as the Costa del Crime, a sunny refuge for British criminals looking to escape the reach of UK law enforcement. For decades, fugitives have hidden in plain sight among the beach bars and golf courses, running their empires from poolside loungers. Ross Monahan, 43, had every reason to feel secure in his Spanish exile. He'd been acquitted of murdering Kevin Gerbil Carroll back in 2010, though the case had made him a marked man in Glasgow. After being shot in the shoulder in 2017, he'd made the sensible decision to relocate to sunnier climes. Eddie Lyons Jr., 46, was visiting his old friend. Both men were senior figures in the Lyons organization, but they were also getting older, possibly looking to step back from the violence that had defined their lives. On that Saturday night, their past finally caught up with them. As the Champions League final ended and customers began filing out of Monahan's bar, a car pulled up outside. Security cameras would later capture what happened next. but they wouldn't capture the identity of the killer. A figure emerged from the vehicle, dressed entirely in black. Some witnesses later described him as blonde-haired, possibly Scottish himself. He moved with purpose, with the confidence of someone who had done this before. 2 shots, 2 bodies, 2 lives ended on a Spanish sidewalk, their blood mixing with the warm Mediterranean evening air. The gunman climbed back into his vehicle and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would send shockwaves from the Costa del Sol all the way back to Glasgow. But here's where this story takes an even more sinister turn. Spanish police have yet to identify the Fuengirola gunman. Scottish authorities have plenty of suspects, but proving which one pulled the trigger will be nearly impossible. The killer is probably already back in Scotland, or perhaps hiding somewhere else in Europe's criminal underground. But Russell Findlay, the man who literally bears the scars of this conflict, raises a troubling possibility. What if the shooter wasn't working for the Daniel gang at all? It could have been the work of their long-standing enemies in Scotland, he says. But out in Spain, they are swimming with much bigger sharks who may be even more ruthless than they are. Think about it. The Lyons gang's partnership with the Kinahan cartel has made them players in an international game where the stakes are measured in hundreds of millions of pounds. At that level, loyalty is temporary and business is everything. Maybe Monaghan and Lyons Jr. knew too much. Maybe they were skimming profits. Maybe they were planning to cooperate with law enforcement. Or maybe they were simply expendable pieces in a much larger chess game. In the world of international drug trafficking, yesterday's partner can become tomorrow's target without warning. The truth is, we may never know who ordered their execution. The Spanish investigation continues, but professional hits like this are designed to leave no traces, no witnesses, no evidence that leads back to those who commissioned the killing. What we do know is that 2 more lives have been claimed by a feud that began with 20,000 pounds of stolen cocaine more than 2 decades ago. A local dispute that has now metastasized into something far more dangerous. As I speak to you now, this war is far from over. Reports emerged last month that the Lyons gang was seeking a truce with their Daniel rivals. Given the recent events in Fuengirola, that seems highly unlikely. Scottish police have arrested over 40 people in connection with the ongoing feud. Angela Constance, Scotland's Justice Secretary, insists that law-abiding citizens have nothing to fear, pointing to overall crime statistics that show recorded crime down 40% since 2006 to 2007. But critics argue that these statistics hide a more troubling reality. While petty crime may be decreasing, organized crime is becoming more sophisticated, more violent, and more international in scope. The gangs aren't just getting stronger, they're getting smarter. Russell Findlay warns that Scotland isn't a narco-state yet, but it's showing alarming signs of heading in that direction. Attacks on journalists, counselors, and prison officers. Intimidation of public officials. The systematic undermining of law and order. This is how these things start, he says. Too often, the response has been to justify and explain, not to punish and deter. The gangs must be rubbing their hands with glee. Meanwhile, in Spain, local authorities are scrambling to respond. Ana Mula, the mayor of Fuengirola, is calling for more resources to combat organized crime. We live in a world, and at a time where crime knows no borders, she says. In places like the Costa del Sol, we're seeing developments that inevitably affect us. We need much greater involvement from the state on this issue. But here's the terrifying reality. This isn't just Scotland's problem anymore. It's not even just Europe's problem. What started as a local feud in Glasgow has now become part of a global network of organized crime that spans continents. The Lyons-Daniel War has connected Scottish housing estates to Irish cartels, Dubai money laundering operations, and South American cocaine routes. This is how modern organized crime works. Local disputes become international incidents. Regional gangs become global players. And violence that starts on the streets of Glasgow ends with bodies falling in Spanish resort towns. The traditional boundaries that once contained criminal activity, national borders, police jurisdictions, even language barriers, have become meaningless. Today's criminals operate like multinational corporations, with supply chains that stretch across continents and management structures that would make legitimate businesses envious. And at the heart of it all, two Scottish families continue their quarter-century war, leaving a trail of bodies, burned buildings, and shattered lives in their wake. The question isn't whether there will be more violence. The question is where it will happen next, and who will be caught in the crossfire. Will it be another shooting in Spain? A firebombing in Glasgow? A machete attack in Edinburgh? Or will the war spread to new territories, new countries, new continents? The only certainty is this: as long as there are millions of pounds to be made from cocaine trafficking, and as long as two families refuse to forgive a 20-year-old theft, the killing will continue. Because in the world of organized crime, some debts are never forgotten, and some wars never end. The next time you hear about gang violence on the news, remember Ross Monahan and Eddie Lyons Jr. bleeding out on a Spanish sidewalk while tourists walked by. Remember that what might seem like distant criminal activity can reach across borders, across decades, across continents to claim new victims. Remember that behind every statistic about organized crime are real people whose lives have been destroyed by violence, intimidation, and fear. The war between the Lyons and Daniel families began with 20,000 pounds of stolen cocaine in 2001. 23 years later, it has claimed countless lives, terrorized entire communities, and transformed from a local dispute into an international crisis. And unless something changes dramatically in how we approach organized crime, not just in Scotland, but globally, this is just the beginning. The question isn't whether you'll hear about this war again. The question is, who will die next? If this story has shocked you, if you want to understand how organized crime continues to spread its tentacles across the globe, then make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the world's most dangerous criminal organizations, uncovering the truth behind the headlines and the human cost of the drug trade. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that gang violence isn't just a local problem anymore. It's a global crisis that affects us all. And let me know in the comments below. Do you think Scotland is doing enough to combat organized crime? Or are the gangs already winning this war? Your voice matters in this conversation. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, the truth is always more dangerous than fiction.